Over to you, Nasir.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Nauza. I'll just get my screen up and give it 30 seconds, and then we'll get started. Good. That works great. Okay, I'm just literally going to give a few more seconds and I'm going to get started. So thanks for your patience. Okay, well let's crack on. Let's crack on. Well, welcome everyone to this webinar, all about writing public sector bids and tenders. Sometimes regarded as a mystery, sometimes regarded as some sort of special system and process. But this is a webinar sponsored under the Hammersmith and Fulham Business Support Programme, and essentially it's one of a number of webinars that we're doing and providing under the programme to help you as local businesses get better at bidding and tendering and winning larger contracts, so to hopefully help increase those local supply chains. So I think you all know the form now. Keep yourselves on mute, cameras off, and those of you who've seen me before know that I'm a fan of writing things down, so I'm old-fashioned. If you want to write things down, please do that. It'll help you remember. It'll help you actually take some action. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat and I'll try and address those at the end when we should have a few minutes. Okay, so just a little bit about me, if you don't know, and my background is all banking for my sins, don't hold it against me, but in seriousness, 30 years at Lloyds, looking at all types of businesses from startups and smaller SMEs right through to international corporates. And one of my key roles was as head of our government team in Lloyds, and that involved a lot of bidding and tendering for both local authority and central government departments. So that's where a lot of my experience comes from in terms of the bidding and tendering process in the public sector. I've been involved in a number of these programs for Branduin. Those of you who don't know us, we're a team of specialist business advisors in London and the South East, and we run these programs on behalf of local authorities and various chambers of commerce. So as you'll see on the screen, I've been involved in the Hounslow and Brent Fit to Bid programs, which are very similar to these. And I've probably run about 100 or 150 one-to-one advice sessions over the last couple of years under these various programs. I'm also an advisor with Branduin. I've got my own small social care business, an advisor at the British Library. So that's basically 40 years of experience condensed into a minute. So I must have been having fun, because time flies when you're having fun. Right, so enough about me. What are we going to cover today? Well, essentially, as I said, it's all about public sector bidding and the tendering process. I'll spend some time talking about terminology, which sometimes can be a little bit confusing. We'll look at the tender documents that are involved in any public sector tender invitation. What I'll also then do is we're going to go through a live invitation to tender, which Branduin were invited to tender for and submitted a bid for and won. I'll then spend some time looking at the evaluation methodology, what councils and local authorities look for when they're evaluating tenders. We'll get into the meat of the evaluation process, nothing to do with butchers. I'll clarify more about that in a few minutes. And we'll also look at the timelines for public sector tenders, which are typically longer than those in the private sector. We'll then also do a little bit of work around the tender business model. And what I mean by that is you looking at your own businesses and seeing how you can best get your business ready for tendering, and looking at it from the perspective of what jobs need to be done by the local authority to achieve their end objective. This is an interactive session, question and answers obviously in the chat, but we'll also do a couple of exercises. So we'll look at tender SWOT, and I'll also talk about social value, which is something that's gaining a lot more prominence in public sector bids. And we'll also spend some time on joining forces and looking at consortium bids, which can often help you. And then finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about our Meet the Buyer event. I say was scheduled for the 21st because unfortunately we now have a tube strike and a rail strike on that day. So we'll touch a bit more about that in a moment towards the end in terms of revised dates. So that's the programme for this morning for the next hour or so, which is fairly full. So let's get on. So in terms of the programme, briefly, for those of you who aren't aware, it's quite a comprehensive programme, kicked off back in February, runs throughout the year, and it's all designed and supported by Hammersmith and Fulham Council to try and help you as local businesses get better and more experienced in the bidding and tendering process. With local authorities and with some larger private sector companies also as well, you're often dealing with a procurement department. So we'll talk to you a little bit about the procurement process, the buying process, because you're invariably dealing with that team rather than the end users. There's an online bidding capability assessment report that we'll do for you. It takes literally 5 minutes to complete, and we'll give you a report showing exactly where you are in terms of your experience as a business in terms of bidding and tendering, where you might need to focus, improve your bidding skills. And the bidding and tendering process is very much a sales process. It's not an administrative exercise. I think some SMEs treat it as such or look at it as a form-filling exercise. And I think it's a lot more than that. So if you're going to be looking at it as an administrative exercise, you're not going to be on your way to a winning bid. So it is a sales process. And then finally, we have these tender advice sessions. The programme sponsors 80 local businesses in Hammersmith and Fulham to have 2 confidential one-to-one advice sessions with a specialist like myself. We've done about 50 at the moment. So if you're interested in getting yourself onto that part of the programme, there's some information at the end. You just need to contact me. And as I said, we have the Meet the Buyer event as well, date to be confirmed. So that's a bit about the programme and the sort of support that is available to you as local businesses in Hammersmith and Fulham. So let's look a little bit about some of the differences between public sector and private sector bids. I mean, the fundamental process is not too dissimilar in terms of the writing of the tender, but there are some key differences, and let's just run through those briefly. So in terms of the public sector organisations, they'll be allocated annual budgets which they need to spend, and they'll be driven in terms of the services they procure and buy based on those annual budgets, to your point. Whereas the private sector organisations, they're driven very much by their day-to-day business requirements. Public sector organisations, local authorities, very much driven, and I use the word restricted by legislation. They have to be seen to be dealing completely within various guidelines and laws and regulations, whereas in the private sector, there are much lower restrictions in terms of the bidding process. Process with local authorities, as I said at the outset, sometimes it's seen as a bit of a mystery. It's, people don't know how to sort of approach local authorities. The process is very detailed. Being blunt to a point, because I've been through it myself, there's an element of bureaucracy, forgive me for saying that, any local authorities, but there is definitely a process, a step-by-step detailed process, which, to be frank, if you understand and follow, you're going to be halfway down the track to submitting a successful bid. Whereas with the private sector, they're very much more, I guess, free-form tender responses. The time period for local authority bids, they'll have a fixed time period, and I'll go through a timetable for you later in the presentation to show you that it's quite a long-term process sometimes. It could be 3, often even longer, 3, 4, 5, 6 months between the initial request for suppliers to get involved in tender to the award of the contract. Whereas again, on the private sector side, it's typically a bit more, it's a quicker process. Local authorities have to be completely transparent. They have to operate on a level playing field, so every potential supplier has exactly the same opportunity, the same information, the same chance to win business from the local authority. So it's a very open, transparent process, so much so that, if one supplier asks a question regarding a tender process, the local authority, the public sector, will publish the answer to all the potential suppliers who are bidding for the contract. So it's very open. What drives local authorities and public sectors? I guess they have to be seen to be spending their money wisely, fairly. It's public sector monies. They have to account for every pound that they need to spend. Of course, they are also looking, as private sector organisations are, for a return on investment. But they have to be seen, as I said, to be completely open and honest in how they spend their money. You'll often find with public sector departments that you are dealing with a number of different stakeholders. I'm using local authorities as an example, but they're quite complex. When I say complex, quite detailed and complex organizations in terms of their structure. And sometimes it can be just quite difficult knowing who to talk to, what the right departments are. So you'll often be dealing with, as I said, a procurement department, an end user, a specialist stakeholder who has an interest in the product, in the service being tendered for. Whereas again, in the private sector, you may be dealing with you might be dealing with one person, for example. And finally, local authorities are definitely looking at ways of reducing their spend. They're all under increasing pricing and funding pressures. They're looking at cost savings, with the private sector very much more driven by increasing their profit margins. The other things, the little sort of diagrams along the bottom, are basically areas, again, of focus for local authorities. Things like the circular economy, how to spend money more wisely, how to sort of empower local communities. Things like, for example, how to get excluded communities involved in the business contracts that are being tendered for by the local authority, how they're more sustainable. There are a number of things in terms of like social value, where local authorities have to be seen and are being seen to try and develop and grow and empower their own communities, so that local communities benefit from the growth. So the whole point of Hammersmith and Fulham encouraging more local supply chains is so that local businesses can benefit from the growth and the business and, you know, the sort of improvements within the council. So there are some key differences, although the underlying writing process is not dissimilar. I just want to refer you briefly, if you haven't seen it, I've done a couple of other webinars about the writing of tender responses, which go into much greater detail around, you know, questioning techniques, evidence. Those recordings are all available to you, and if you need the links for those, we can send them to you, and it'll give you much greater detail on writing the underlying tenders. So, what are some of the key issues that businesses face? All this feedback here that you see on the screen is from the one-to-ones that I and my colleagues in Branduin have had with local businesses like yourselves. So it's all real feedback. So the first thing we often hear is that businesses don't have experience in the public sector. Well, what I would encourage you to do there, and it might sound very obvious, is get that experience. There's a huge, huge amount of information that local authorities publish, either on their website, online, they'll publish papers. Hammersmith and Fulham are particularly good in that sense. They have, like, you know, procurement strategy documents. They have definitions of what they regard as a good supplier. They provided details of the areas where they'll be looking to spend in the next 6, 12, 18 months. They've got obviously various social media channels. It takes time and effort, but certainly you can build up and develop your experience in the public sector. The public sector is huge. So obviously pick a part that you can help with from the perspective of your own business, and then focus on that. We also hear that, you know, the industry is dominated by large companies. You're blocked out, you know, local authorities, once they get involved with one supplier, they never change. That's not strictly speaking true. Certainly, once you get a contract with a local authority, providing you deliver, you evidence how well you delivered, you meet the objectives of the contract, yes, you will be in quite a strong position when the contract is up for renewal. But they are looking to increase their supply chains. And certainly something else we'll talk about is perhaps buddying up or consortium bidding. So if you're a smaller company, for example, and you feel you don't have the experience for a tender you want to submit in each and every area required, you might want to partner up. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. people say, well, my business isn't known to the public sector buyers. Well, again, I've had feedback from a number of SMEs I spoke to saying exactly this, which is, well, I can't speak to the local authorities because that prejudices the tender process, isn't it? So I just have to wait for the tender to come out. Absolutely not true. Local authorities, public sector departments, they're just like any other client, and you can talk to them. As I said, when this program was launched, we had the head of the business unit from Hammersmith and Fulham Council, the head of the procurement department in Hammersmith and Fulham, all encouraging you as local businesses to get in touch, build a dialogue. You might not be able to speak to them directly, you'll be able to speak to their team, certainly. So start building those relationships. But before you make that contact, think about your message. Think about how it is you can add value, what you're going to say, how you're going to sort of demonstrate that you're the sort of supplier that they ought to start talking to. So there are ways of getting your business known to public sector and local authority organisations. People say, well, I can't reach the right people. They're all there. We've given you, and we'll happily share with you, context of the key people within Hammersmith and Fulham. And they've got organograms, they've got details on their website of who to talk to and who to contact. It can be difficult to get through, but you've got to be persistent, and you will get through to the right people. And once you do, ultimately, people in the local authorities, people in the councils, they're just like you and I. They're just people who want to get a job done. So I would encourage you to sort of make that effort to start to build your relationships, do your research, get to know the people. Businesses talk about practical criteria stopping them being considered. They might not even know where tenders are advertised and promoted. Well, I'll share with you the websites that basically local authorities use for those things. The other thing we've come across, and certainly I have, is with a number of local authorities, with a number of businesses, maybe those who've already got a contract with a local authority, is that there's a lack of proactive marketing activity. So, they're not getting case studies, testimonials, because certainly as evaluators within the council, they will always look for evidence of what you say. So if you've got those case studies, you've got reviews, you've got LinkedIn recommendations, you've got Google reviews, all helps you in terms of making your case about being a strong supplier. Time constraints. You know what it's like as a small business owner. You've always got lots of things on your plate. So, I hear this, that, well, I haven't got enough time to plan properly for submissions. Well, what I would say there is, if you're going to tender, if you're going to get involved in bidding and tendering, then you need to do it properly. There's no point going at it half-heartedly. And yes, it does take time and effort. Initially on your first submission, of course. But if you plan it properly, and we also have a session on that, which we run separately in terms of project managing the tender process, then, it's just a case of prioritizing the time to effectively make a submission within the right timescales. And then, the final ones are things like, really not understanding how the process works, how to write strong bids, and not quite sure what to put into your response to make it a winning bid rather than just a bid submission. All these things I will cover to a point today, but they're also much more heavily covered in the previous two webinars I've also done, which are online. So if you're serious about getting involved with tendering and bidding for the public sector and local authority market, then I would encourage you to have a look at those two previous webinars as well. So I'll share, as it says, some of they're secrets only because people don't know about them. They're not really secrets. It's just the information is out there. You just need to go and find it. And that will certainly help you overcome challenges when you're thinking about how to submit winning tender bids. Right, okay, so let's talk about terminology. It can be quite confusing sometimes because there's so many different terms. So to start with, you might have seen something called a pre-qualification questionnaire. And that's probably the sort of first stage questionnaire in any tender process. And it'll ask you, specific information about your company. It might ask you things like, details of your insurance, what sort of similar contracts you've worked on. And they're often simple yes or no questions. They might ask you, things about, fraudulent activity, disbarred directors. Because like I said earlier, the council have to be seen to be completely transparent and playing by all the rules. So that's often the first sort of document you'll see in a tender process. The invitation to tender is, I guess, the key document. It's where you have to submit your proposals for quality of your offer and your costing, where you price the job that needs to be done, and you answer a number of technical questions in terms of your ability to carry out the service in accordance with the spec that the council have outlined. So that's a key document you'll often see. And like I said, we will run through a live example of that as part of this session. The next one you'll come across sometimes is a request for proposal. Again, very similar to ITT. And basically, requests for proposals are often used in situations where the client, where the local authority either can't or doesn't want to define the scope of the work required up front because they haven't quite decided what needs to be done. So that, I guess that means you need to be very descriptive in your response, and they need to state a clear proposal of what's needed. So subtly different to the ITT. Next one you might come across, request for quotation. Again, not like a tender. Typically a smaller in terms of size and scope, often geared when clients are seeking pricing information for a particular piece of work or particular supply of material. So they're often not as detailed as the ITTs. And the final two, framework agreements you may have come across, they're essentially agreements between a number of either one organisation, a number of suppliers, or vice versa, where essentially the suppliers are sort of contractually bound to submit offers for various services that the council might require. The dynamic purchasing system, very similar to framework agreements, but basically an electronic agreement. I guess the two exceptions are that new businesses, new suppliers can join at any time, and it's run very much as an electronic process. So quite a lot of detail there in terms of terminology, but typically you'll see a pre-qualification questionnaire as a start point, and then you'll have, for most types of business, an ITT, but with those caveats I mentioned below. So quite a lot to get your head around there, but once you understand it, not so difficult. So let's go through, as I said, this is the sort of information, the pack of information that you will typically get in an invitation to tender. And like I say, I'm going to go through it on the basis of a tender that Branduin submitted bid for. It was a business support program, because that's what we do, obviously. And we'll run through it in some detail. So to start with, you'll get a big, thick pack, generally, of information. And I would encourage you to review that very carefully. When I used to get these things through from the council when I was in my banking days, you get through it, you put a cold towel in your head, go into a room and just highlight all the key information. So these are typical things you'll get. You'll have an introduction from the council explaining a bit of background about the tender, the sort of timeline, what they're looking for. Then you'll have all the legal tender conditions, because as I said, they have to comply with certain regulations. So read those all carefully. And then the key bit, which is the specification. And that's a description of the service, the work that they need you to provide. So that's the bit you need to look at and think about quite carefully. They'll then have some actual instructions for submission of your tender, and they'll be very specific. They'll be in a certain format, they'll be on a certain template. You may have restrictive word counts for certain areas. So that means, they'll say in this particular section, you can only use 500 words, this section 300 words, whatever it might be. And so even to the extent where, for example, they might say you need to submit what's called an expression of interest or a pre-qualification questionnaire. If it says it's got to be back to the council by midday on the 8th of June, don't send it at 12:05, because you'll be immediately excluded from the process. So follow those instructions very carefully. The next bit you'll get is like the qualitative tender response. So that's basically all the detailed questions you need to answer from your perspective as a bidder regarding the tender and the services that council are requesting. And then you'll have obviously a pricing and delivery schedule. That's where you have to put in your various costings, timelines for delivery, and how you'll actually implement the service or product. There's often a form of tender, which is declaration, all bidders need to sign, and then a certificate of non-collusion, which declares that you as a bidder, you've not sort of colluded with any other bidders on the tender. So it's an independent bid that you put together yourself. Or if you are bidding as a consortium. We'll talk about that separately. That's absolutely fine. And then finally, you'll have like a draft of the proposed contract, which would need to be signed by the successful bidder in due course. And you may also have like a draft of a service level agreement, an SLA. So read that pack through, review the pack very carefully, as I said, and follow the instructions to the letter, because like I said, it's not a particularly difficult process, but it is a very clear, detailed, specified process. So let's have a look at what the key ITT requirements are. There are two key areas where the council will be looking to assess you at a strategic level. One is your suitability as a supplier, and then your technical ability, technical method statement, how you're going to deliver the service that they're asking for. And these things are very, very important to local authority bids. So you can see on the slide, there are certain, these are also yes, no answers. There are certain things they'll ask you in terms of questions which will mean you're automatically excluded from the process. There'll be things about fraud, crime, director misconduct, business misconduct, bar directors, money laundering, all the sort of things that hopefully none of you are involved with, because if you are, you will be excluded. And then they also have some discretionary exclusion clauses as well. So an example there might be that a director may have had a county court judgment, a CCJ, against them, but it's been repaid. In that situation, the council have the ability to, review and decide whether or not to include and keep the company within the tender process. So there are certainly a number of things that they'll look at in terms of your suitability. They'll ask you a lot of financial information, quite standard financial information. And the first thing that may be a criteria in a typical tender is you have to have a minimum level of turnover. So they want to be dealing with companies of a certain size. I mean, we're not talking millions or necessarily hundreds of thousands, but you need to make sure you meet that minimum turnover threshold. Otherwise, it says your bid may be rejected. It's not necessarily black and white, but if they're saying you have to have a minimum turnover of, I don't know, 100,000, and your company has a turnover of 10,000, then you're going to have to have a very good reason for them to choose you over and above something they've specified. They'll ask for details of what your turnover was last year. They'll ask for your financial year end. They'll ask for details of your bankers and do you have an accountant for your organisation? They also may run credit checks on your company, and that's basically to see what the risk profile is. Less so with smaller SMEs, but certainly with larger contracts, they'll be looking at the external sort of risk rating for your organisation, and it's typically high, medium, or low. As it says there, if you're a high or medium risk company, then they might ask you to submit further information to ensure that they're happy with your financial standing as a potential supplier. So lots of information around, as I say, finances and the company specifically. They'll want to know details of your various levels of insurance cover. The typical ones, as you can see there, are employee liability, public liability, and professional indemnity. And they'll specify the coverage level that is required within the contract being tendered for. And you have a couple of options. You can basically tell them that you already hold that level of cover. If you do, that's fantastic. Or alternatively, if you don't, or you hold a lower level of cover, that you're willing to basically get that level of cover if you are successful in the contract. So you can provide that information further down the line to a point, say, yes, I'm prepared to get 10 million of employee liability cover, for example. And then there are also a few additional suitability clauses, basically saying, are there any material reasons why you might not be able to complete the performance of this contract if you're successful? Things like, financial reasons, expertise, capacity. There are a number of things that they'll be looking at to check that you're suitable as a potential supplier. So that's the first area. Then you get into what is called, I guess, the technical method statement. Method statements are something that seem to cause a lot of thought, if that's the right word, for businesses that I'm talking to. So let's just run through the sort of things that they'll be looking for. This is when you're starting to build up your technical tender response. So, we talk about how you propose to deliver the service for what the council are asking for. This is a tender, as I said, for a business support program. So the questions are based around that. So it says, an overview of the training that you'd provide, including, what courses you'd basically be providing in terms of training, how you'd mitigate any risk, what challenges you think you might face. So think about it, obviously, from your own business perspective. And I'll talk about the weighting, which is the column on the right, towards the end in a minute or two. They'll ask you for a mobilization plan. And what that means is how are you actually going to implement the product or service that basically is being tendered for? What's your plan? Do you have a nice Excel spreadsheet? Do you have project management technology? How are you going to implement, and what tasks need to be done to get that done? They'll ask things about your management structure. What is the management structure of your organization? Who's going to be responsible for delivering the program? What are their qualifications? What's their background experience? Their competence? Have they dealt with similar contracts like this in the past? What sort of continuity arrangements do you have in place for backup when things go wrong? Classic example, we're trying to run this event on the 21st of June as a tube strike. We've got a backup plan for that. So make sure that you answer these questions as fully as you can. Then again, a key area, they'll ask about your relevant experience delivering similar business support services. So in this case, it says, both online and face-to-face. For Branduin, we've done a lot of these programs. We've got loads of case studies. We've got lots of sort of testimonials from clients. And so that puts us in a strong position. What I would say to you when you're looking at your own business is make sure you have that content, that evidence, if you like, of what you've done. It'll talk about, what sort of similar projects you've done perhaps in the last few years. What were the contract values? What services did you provide? And the more you can evidence you have experience in the area being tendered for, guess what? The better you will score when they are evaluating your tender. For this contract, again, it was a business support program. So we're talking about how we'll engage businesses from a wide range of different SMEs to participate in our programs. Everything from underprivileged or SMEs in areas of economic decline, and basically specialist areas of businesses who perhaps struggle, ethnic minorities, as you see on the last point. They'll say how we engage BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic company, SMEs, and how we get them to be involved in the program. So there are a number of things that are asked to see how we will deliver, how we'll market it, our experience, and they'll be asking all these things for your business as well when you're bidding for contracts. And then final question, typically they'll ask about is the London living wage, because now there is this drive to try and ensure employees are properly paid. So I said I'd talk about the weighting. So just going back briefly, you can see on the column down the right, there is a weighting, the percentage value allocated to each area. So for example, with the service delivery, you can see that is the largest area which they're giving. So 25% of the scoring is to do with how we will deliver that project. Another high weighting area, experience. How much experience have we got in the area? How many similar programs have we done? What sort of feedback did we get? What were the contract values? So you can see from that where you need to focus your energy, your effort in making sure you address the points with the highest weighting, because that will give you a much better chance to score more highly in the evaluation process, which I'll now move on to. So I talked about MEAT, new term to me as well, and stands for most economically advantageous tender. And the definition that I'll read to you briefly says, is criteria which enables the contracting local authority to take account of a criteria that reflects qualitative, technical and sustainable aspects of the tender submission, as well as price when reaching an award decision. So it's basically what it's saying there is that the local authority will have a number of different criteria under which they will assess the tender submissions. And you can see in the box down the right, the sort of areas that they will cover. None of these, I'm sure, will be new to you. They want to know the quality of the service, pricing. I'll talk about that in a minute. Cheapness is not always best. Your technical ability. I touched upon social value. That's something I'll talk about more in a moment, creating gaining much greater prominence? What are the environmental benefits? How innovative are you? Have you the ability to deliver on what you say? So there's a number of factors that they'll look at when they're assessing the submissions from suppliers. And they'll basically evaluate the tenders on a combination of price and quality. And if you see if you look at the slide, the first bullet point, it says that there's 75% focus on price and a service of product, which is like a commoditized product. So it might be something straightforward like a cleaning contract. I'm not trying to knock cleaning companies, but basically what they're saying is we want the best price. We want the cheapest price. Yes, of course, we need to have quality, but we believe all good cleaning companies can clean. So it's price specific. So that's where you'd have to go in more keenly if it was a 75% weighting on price. The flip side of that, of course, is if they're looking for perhaps something that's a much more complex service and the focus is very much more on quality. You can see that there was a higher focus on quality in the example that I talked to you about Branduin earlier. So depending on where it is, you can see where the local authority are focusing and what's more important to them. And they'll use this weighted criteria, and they'll do a sort of combined evaluation, and then they'll aggregate the scores together to basically see, and then shortlist a number of different suppliers to present. So let's have a quick look at the evaluation methodology. This is just an example. They'll score it 0 to 5, and of course, you want to be scoring 5 or 4 or 5 as much as you can. And you can see there that to get an excellent score, you need to be going over and above the required standards. So if they've asked for a certain thing to be done, how have we demonstrated you go over and above? How can you add value? How can you show that you can measure the additional value or the additional efficiencies you're providing? You provided answers, with precision and relevance. You've included things that are innovative. You demonstrate how you'll add value. All these things will basically give you a chance to score much more highly. And just running down the slide, I won't go through the whole detail. Right down the bottom, you can see that, if you have an inadequate response, you failed to meet the standard, you haven't provided enough detail, you haven't answered the questions properly, you haven't answered them at all. I cover all this also in my previous webinar, so do take a look at that. And these processes are very helpful because they plot all this into a matrix essentially, and they're very useful when they've got 2 or more good tender responses, and then they can literally see how close each one is in terms of scoring to then decide who to bring in to present for a shortlist. Right, conscious of time, let's crack on. So I talked about the timetable being quite long. So here's a typical timetable for a local authority, and as you can see, it can start back in early July where the tenders published, and there's a whole host of different steps that will go through before the contract is awarded, potentially 3 months later. One thing I just want to focus on is clarifications. These are areas which the local authority may clarify with suppliers, so make sure you read those, or there may be questions that suppliers have asked to clarify and they'll be shared. So in terms of planning your response, like I said earlier, read that timetable carefully. Make sure you know what the deadlines are for the various steps, particularly writing the bid. Whatever you do, don't leave it to the last day or the last few days to basically get your submission in. And always work to the deadline the day before, because you'll invariably run out of time. So the whole point there is plan effectively, plan well in advance, use a simple Excel spreadsheet, put in there the tasks that need to be done down the vertical, put in the sort of timelines across the top. If you've got a team of people who are going to be helping you, supporting you in writing the tender, get them mobilized, get them going day one, because the earlier you start, the better your tender response and basically the better your ultimate chance of winning. So let's just have a little think about jobs to be done. I mean, essentially, every local authority, they need to get a job done as part of their tender. And the key thing here is for you as suppliers is always focus on what the buyer wants and not what you want to sell. And what I mean by that is essentially often a number of companies think, well, we do lots of this great stuff and there's a tender that's reasonably relevant to what we do. Let's just tell them everything we can do and some of it will stick and that'll be great. Well, it won't, unfortunately, because you need to be specific. You need to demonstrate basically what it is they're trying to achieve. What are the efficiencies? What are the benefits? So that's why I'm saying always try and put yourself in the mind of the local authority, look at it from their viewpoint, not from your viewpoint. Think about what's the underlying problem. What job are they trying to get done? And then find ways of demonstrating how you can add value, how you can develop a winning strategy, how you can basically help them meet those desired needs and outcomes. And if you think of it from that perspective, you're much more likely to be on the way to submitting a winning bid. So I've done a lot of talking, so it's time to get you guys to do a little bit of work. So first exercise here is all around these jobs to be done. And essentially what I want you to do is just spend a couple of minutes thinking about this and writing something down, put some stuff in the chat if you want to, from the perspective of your own business, but thinking about what it is the customer's trying to get done that will lead to the outcome that they want. So an outcome might be that the local authority want to increase the percentage of ethnic minority employees, for example. And the job to be done might be, well, okay, we need to improve, we need to change, we need to remodel our recruitment process. So just spend a minute or so thinking about that, thinking about what you provide as a service, then how you can turn it around to help a local authority, a public sector department, achieve what they want to solve as a problem. What are their needs? What are their sort of strategic, bigger picture challenges which you can help with? I'll give you a minute just to do that while I rest my voice, and yeah, just jot a few things down on that and see, as I say, if you can put your mind and your business model into a way that is going to help the local authority. Because essentially, you need to adapt your business, your process to fit the local authority, because they won't. So as it says at the bottom, if you can define your tender and bidding strategy around this idea of jobs to be done, it'll help you align and invest your resources most effectively, because the tender and bidding process is time consuming. It does take effort. So if you're going to do it, as I said earlier, do it well and start planning in advance for the things you know you're going to need. So if you haven't got any case studies or testimonials, or they're out of date, or there's some poor ones, build into your process and target getting 10 new testimonials or case studies by the year end. Get 1 or 2 a month. You know what will be needed, so start getting that content available in advance. Okay, well, I'll just give you a few more seconds to think about that. And I know it's not something you can do necessarily in 2 minutes, but hopefully it just starts your thought process thinking around this business about meeting the outcomes and meeting the jobs to be done by the local authority. Okay, so let's move on. I want to just talk a little bit about your own business tender models. And this is all basically based on an approach called the business model canvas. You may have come across that if you've been on any of our previous programs, which is a very succinct way of analyzing your business and its challenges on one page. So there are 5 different lenses, and I'll just touch briefly on those and explain the background there. So in terms of desirability, we need to be, as it says, desirable to our clients. We need to have something that our customer wants. Otherwise, we're not going to have any sales, essentially. So as I say, you need to have products that clients actually want. You need to be able to implement in a way that's feasible. I say that you have to have a plan that you can demonstrate that not only do you have a product that people want, but how will you mobilize, how will you implement, how will you project manage it so that it basically is helpful and delivers for the end user, local authority, the end client. It needs to be financially viable. So, you need to know your market, you need to know your costs, you need to know your margins, your pricing, because, otherwise you're going to lose money and you're going to ultimately go bankrupt. So it needs to be financially viable. And this, again, is an area where, in terms of adaptability, you need to be thinking about a lot, because it's gaining much greater prominence. And that is essentially sustainability. As I said, how sustainable is your business? Because this is something that is gaining huge awareness now in the world we live in. And it's all linked around the purpose, as I say, we need to have a positive impact on the planet, as I say, I think the way the world is moving, it's, focusing on carbon neutral reduction, waste management, less use of plastic, whatever it is you and your business are selling, developing, in terms of your growth strategy, think about the purpose from the perspective of sustainability, because certainly local authorities, and in fairness, also private sector organizations, this is something that is very high up on their list of priorities. So if you can demonstrate you're thinking along similar lines, again, you're going to put yourself in a much stronger position. So second little exercise for you to have a think about. I'm sure you've all seen and maybe even done SWOT analysis on your business. You certainly will do if you have a one-to-one with me. And essentially, I want you to try and look at it from the perspective of your own tenders and responding to tender. How can you demonstrate that you can add value in your tender response? And how can you demonstrate you can be innovative? So again, I'll just give you a minute to jot down some things in those various boxes there, or on a bit of paper, because the more you think about how you can differentiate from your competitors, how you can add value, how you can show that you're the sort of supplier that the local authority should deal with, you've got evidence, you've got experience, the stronger position you will be in when you submit your bid. What are the sort of opportunities for you in terms of the business that you provide? Is it a particularly prestigious customer? Just think, if you had Hammersmith and Fulham as a client on your list of clients, and you get a nice testimonial and a case study from them, guess what? That might be a great introduction for you to get into talking to other local authorities. So again, you need to think about partnering up with people where you perhaps haven't got experience in all the relevant areas. So think about those things for a moment. Jot a couple of things down if you can. I'm conscious that time is moving on. Then we'll keep going for a few more minutes. Right. Conscious of time, I'm going to sort of leave you to think about that after the session, if I may, and move on. Let's talk about social value. Like I said, this is something that is gaining much greater prominence with local authorities and businesses as a whole in general. So it's not something you can avoid, if you like. So social value is essentially improvements made to the social, economic, and environmental well-being of a local area when tendering. So when you're tendering in Hammersmith and Fulham, what are you doing to help the local community? What is it that you're doing in terms of perhaps helping local people get more jobs? There's some examples down the bottom. What are you doing to help in terms of the environment? It's all about thinking of ways to demonstrate that you are looking beyond the pounds, if you like, beyond the return. What's the bigger picture in terms of the benefit you can add to the community? So, do you have a social value policy? If you don't, you're going to be tendering for council business. Well, guess what? It'd be a good idea to have one and get one put in place. There's lots of information about this online, of course. There are templates for social value, which you can think about and use to adapt and have something in place for your own business. I was talking to a business a couple of weeks ago, and they particularly work with disadvantaged young people. That's a great social value thing to have on your CV, if you like, or have on your business description, that you work with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to try and give them chances of work experience. It was all about helping them to understand entrepreneurial skills. So what a great thing to do for disadvantaged young people. So think from your own perspective, in your own business, what you can be doing and how you can demonstrate that you do have some sort of social value policy. So I touched upon partnerships. So here's a proverb for you. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And what it's saying there is, sometimes it is quicker to get things done by yourself, but actually, to make longer term gains, you might want to partner up with someone who's going to help you produce a stronger value bid. Let's just talk a little bit about consortium bidding. So the definition is 2 or more organisations who are not able to individually meet the requirements of the ITT in full, and they sort of take the view that actually if we come together collectively, we can put together a stronger winning bid. So, find businesses that can complement what you do, perhaps subcontract. The thing with local authorities is they will only contract with one legal entity. So, for example, if you are going to go and try and buddy up with another business, one or more, then one member of the consortium needs to act as the lead member to submit the bid, and that's who the local authority will contract with. That's who the local authority will pay. They'll expect them to deliver the service. How they manage the underlying other companies is up to them. And there are various different ways you can put those structures together. You might have a separate single legal entity, a special purpose vehicle. You might have a partnership arrangement put in place, or you just might put in place a consortium bid where one business agrees to be the lead partner, and then they liaise with the underlying specialist subcontractors. So there are various different ways of structuring these things. Things to think about, what are the legal arrangements? How's it being financed? How's it being governed overall? Who's responsible for decision making, the management? What are the exit arrangements for certain partners? What sort of financial liabilities are people going to have? What are the penalties? But the key thing is, if you are submitting a consortium bid, is that the bid document must read as a single document. It mustn't, so even for example, if you've got 3 companies and you're essentially all writing different parts of the bid, it can't be apparent to the local authority that there are 3 different styles of language, 3 different styles of text. It's got to be read as one single document, as if it's written by one person. And you can get external bid specialists to help you with that process and help you manage the process and the deadlines, and also provide some external challenge to various consortium members with some recommendations and observations. So don't be shy about thinking about working with other people if you can't go it alone. Right, so we've got about 5 minutes, so let's see how we're doing. That's good. So here are a few little suggestions and tips to get you started. So start with a particular sector or subsector within the public sector market. Define your value proposition. Again, what value is it you add? How do you define that? We run a session on that as well under the programme. So if you've never done that, very useful to do it. Focus your efforts where it matters. It takes time and effort, as I said, to produce a tender response. So focus where you get the biggest bang for your buck. Subcontract where you have to. If you haven't got direct experience, you haven't got case studies in the area, perhaps buddy up with another business. Think big but start small. Larger contracts, more complex. But to get yourself into the process, no harm in starting with those smaller contracts, getting your right policies in place. Look for niche opportunities. Look on LinkedIn. Get yourself set up on the tender alerts. Go to various networking opportunities. Look out for advanced notifications like this Meet the Buyer event. Often local authorities will pre-engage with the market. Think about how you can differentiate. Talk about things like social value, community wealth. And then finally, don't think about can you just do it, but think about can you actually win it, because that's the most important thing. Right, so in summary, a number of things to consider when you're writing any tender. Have you complied with all the terms of the ITT? Have you answered that question about why you? Have you provided strong evidence? Have you put yourself into the mindset of the customer, used their terminology? Have you talked about value and benefits? Is it correctly priced? Is it a professional, well-written proposal? Have you made it easier for the evaluators to evaluate and provided sufficient evidence? If you can tick all those boxes, you'll be well on the way to a positive and strong bid. Right, so we're just about running out of time. So here are some places where you can find where local authorities advertise their various tender contracts. Hammersmith and Fulham advertise them directly, and also there's a website called the London Tenders Portal where all local authorities advertise their business. There's a national portal as well, and also there are some other websites, Find a Tender, Contract Finder, which you can get set up on just so you get those alerts. You can see the types of contracts that local authorities are tendering for. Okay, so last few minutes, I just want to touch upon our Meet the Buyer event. As I say, it was scheduled for the 21st of June, but unfortunately the good old transport system have decided to have a load of strikes on that day. So we're having a rethink as to how that or when that's going to work. We do want to do a face-to-face event rather than online, because I think that works better. The structures, it's really interesting. It gives you a chance to basically meet key decision makers, key influence, key buyers from both the council, from the procurement team, from the private sector, and it'll also be a Q&A session where you can ask them questions about what things are coming up in the next few months, who do you contact, where do you find out more information. Like I said at the outset, it is all still about building relationships. So consequently, if you've met the key people within the council where you're trying to get business, it's definitely going to help when you actually put your bid in. So watch this space. We'll be in touch very shortly about the change date, because as I say, the 21st has been scuppered by the transport strikes. Okay, so just to finish off briefly, as I said, there are a number of different webinars that we're running as part of the program to help you with your bid writing. I'll be running a couple more specific bid writing tender webinars in July. We do a session on evaluating your own tender business model. That's a wider look at your business. Talks about, you know, value proposition, USP, what's your strategy, how do you innovate, those types of things. We run a session about designing products and services for procurement, because like I said, you're often dealing with procurement departments, you're not dealing with the end users. The project management one, that's great, that's run by Tony, and it just gives you a structure for planning your submissions, because they can be quite complex things to deal with. We've got a LinkedIn specialist who will help you in terms of your marketing, making the most out of LinkedIn, and then this subject that I talked about, which is like the circular economy, developing key partnerships, which is key for SMEs now in the world we're living in. You know, what are the global challenges of climate change, waste, pollution, sustainability? You know, how do you better manage and use various different resources? So there's lots of support there in terms of the webinar. The links at the bottom, they're free, so do come along and join us. They're all recorded if you can't make them, so we hope to see some of you on those future sessions. And to finish up, as I said, we have these one-to-one sessions. They're very structured, they're very much task focused. There'll be a record of essentially what we've discussed, action points for you as a business to work on between the first and second sessions, and support during that time period as well. And we've been getting some, thankfully, great feedback from the SMEs, and there are 80 companies that are sponsored on that program. We've done about 50 already, so you know, do get in touch with me. My details are there on the slide. If you want to basically book a one-to-one session, the only criteria is you need to be based in the Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And the whole idea is we'll help you get to a point in your bidding and tendering knowledge where you can submit an expression of interest to a local authority, which basically, or to a private sector organisation, and then following that, hopefully submit a winning bid. Right, well, we're just about out of time, but as I said at the start, it's always good to write stuff down. So while we've got a minute or two, just jot down, if you can do 2 or 3 things, but if not, just one thing that you're going to do as a result of what you've heard today, because it's all well and good sitting in on these webinars and thinking, well, that was hopefully interesting, and then going back and, you know, carrying on with your day job as if nothing changed. So if nothing changes, then why bother? So, you know, just commit to yourself, commit to do 1 or 2 things that will help you in terms of improving your bidding and tendering knowledge. It might be something as simple as, you know, research social value policies, get more case studies, whatever that might be. Make a commitment to yourself to actually do something as a result of what you've heard this morning. Right, okay, well, I think we're just about out of time, so thank you very much for your attendance. Now, I think if you're still there, I don't know if we have any questions in the chat. If there are, I'll be happy to try and answer those.
The question on, a few questions, it says, is there a session on contract negotiations? Well, I would recommend that David and anybody else who's interested attends some of the other sessions over the next a few months. We can try to cover that as well.
Yeah, and we can also cover those in the one-to-one sessions to an extent as well.
Yes, that's a good point. So one-to-one sessions, yes.
Anything else from anyone? And if you obviously got any feedback on the session, hopefully positive, do pop that in the chat as well.
Okay. Many thanks everybody, and thank you to Noshir.
Pleasure.
Speak to you soon.
Hopefully that's been useful. All the best, everyone. Speak to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.